Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. A lot has been said of China's rise, some of it complimentary, some of it not. The West is making hay while the sun shines by continuing to invest in the People's Republic of China, or PRC. This Western investment is generally unencumbered by politics. China might be a communist dictatorship, but it is not considered a geopolitical threat in the same way as the old Soviet Union was. Ideology may divide the communist Chinese from the West, but what unites them is the pursuit of wealth. This peculiar situation came about from China's opening to the world in 1978. Then Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping capitalized on the West's wish to open up a solid front against the common threat posed by the Soviet Union, and Deng seized the opportunity to exploit the West's desire for cheap labor, cheaper costs of doing business, and, as a consequence, welcomed Western investment to fulfill his domestic development ambitions. The rest, as they say, is history. In 2018, the PRC has the second most powerful economy in the world. The country is the 21st century workshop of the world, highly dependent on the West in terms of its capital inflows necessary to sustain the communist-capitalist hybrid leviathan. But with wealth comes power, and with power comes the desire to extend one's might. In this sense, China is no different to other countries that have reached a certain point where they seek to promote and extend their influence abroad using statecraft, soft power, and military coercion. Over the next few weeks, we will be exploring modern China's growth as an international actor. We will look at various regions in the world to which Beijing has firmly set its sights on. Is what we are seeing in China a bold global experiment, an experiment in which an authoritarian surveillance state of over 1 billion people, interlinked to the global economy and which is indispensable to markets everywhere while maintaining central planning and an iron grip on power domestically and where possible internationally, fated to rule the world? The PRC is not an enemy state like the Soviet Union was, but it is not a friend to the West either. The central question we will be asking is there a moral hazard in having a hand in the development of an authoritarian state? The more Communist Party apparatchiks accumulate in wealth and technology, the more robust they become in their challenge to the Western-led international order. Perhaps this is no problem for the Western corporate giants that have found homes in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Guangzhou. Perhaps this is not even a problem for the governments that have encouraged their corporate alphas to leave home shore to make their fortunes in China. However, it may be a problem for these governments when they come face to face with Chinese geopolitical intransigence. China may be interlinked to the Western economies, but its political foundations are not the same, and this is where a confusing divergence and convergence plays out, where Chinese money to the West and trade and Western investment to China continues in parallel with political and strategic conflicts. Today, our first take on this enormous topic is Latin America and the Caribbean, and for this we are honored to be joined by well-known American author and commentator, Dr. Robert Evan Ellis. Dr. Ellis is Research Professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. Dr. Ellis has published more than 170 works, including China in Latin America, The Whats and Wherefores, Lynn Reena Publishers, 2009, The Strategic Dimension of Chinese Engagement with Latin America, William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, 2013, and China on the Ground in Latin America, Palgrave Macmillan, 2014. Dr. Ellis has presented his work in a broad range of business and government forums in 26 countries throughout 4 continents and has given testimony on Chinese activities in Latin America to the US Congress. Dr. Ellis has discussed his work regarding China and other external actors in Latin America on a broad range of radio and television programs. He is cited regularly in print media in both the United States and Latin America for his work in this area. Dr. Ellis holds a PhD in political science with a specialization in comparative politics. Unfortunately, today we'll be without the able assistance of David and Shahrazad, who both are engaged at their day jobs. However, they have forwarded me questions for Dr. Ellis. Evan, welcome to Strategicon.
Very happy to be here with you.
Evan, former Trump Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said of the PRC's investment in Latin America, and I quote, "Today China is gaining a foothold in Latin America. It is using economic statecraft to pull the region into its orbit. The question is, at what price?" End quote. Obama-era Secretary of State John Kerry lamented, and I quote, "The era of the Monroe Doctrine is over," end quote. Since U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams crafted the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, the U.S. largely dominated the Western Hemisphere at an official level. It effectively was a doctrine of no interference in the affairs of existing European colonies in Latin America and the Caribbean, and sought to prevent the New World of the Americas from becoming another global cockpit. It effectively allowed the US to move between North and South American continents unmolested, giving the US its own sphere of influence. As the 19th century moved on, however, British indirect colonial interests became a major force in the development of many South American countries. But because these interests did nothing to jeopardize US dominance, they were allowed to continue without challenge. My first question is, was John Kerry right? Is the Monroe Doctrine, the foundation of US geostrategic dominance over the Western Hemisphere, dead?
Well, it's a great question, and I very much appreciate your historical perspective on the matter. And it was interesting. I remember I was there when, before the Organization of American States, John Kerry made the comment about the Monroe Doctrine, and the applause from the largely Latin American members there was thundering. And I remember just hours after, a number of my Chinese friends both contacted me by internet and elsewise, and said, well, did Secretary Kerry really mean it? We live in an era of globalization in which not only the doctrine but also the message is communicated throughout the world. And certainly what the statement that was made by the Monroe Doctrine by Secretary Kerry was important, but I think it, as well as Secretary Tillerson's remarks, have been misrepresented in many ways. And I think to correct the strategic record, first of all, it was important, as you suggested, to really focus on the idea that when the United States, when Secretary Monroe made the statement, it was an idea of American solidarity, emphasizing the U.S. as part of the Americas against what was seen as European interventionism. At the time, the United States was only a few years away from trying to escape from its own then British European interventionism. And as you rightly pointed out, it wasn't just the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch and the French and a number of others whose activities in the hemisphere were tested. But obviously, with U.S. dominance in the region, it came to be recognized as a type of everybody but the United States keep out, and especially with the fight against Cuba, or the fight to support Cuba against a Spanish intervention, it took on a certain new meaning. It's important, though, to recognize that when Secretary Tillerson was preparing to leave for Latin America, he was not trying to undermine or reassert the Monroe Doctrine in contrast to what John Kerry had said, but rather I think it was a symbol of the new attitude that the United States is trying to put forth, perhaps not well communicated. But it's an attitude that the United States is no longer in a position in this era of interdependence and globalization to say Latin America cannot have relationships with other actors cannot have relationships in Latin America, but rather, we, the United States, have a vested interest in the Americas, because in terms of governance and crime and economic dependencies, what happens in the Americas affects us. And we have responsibility to be a good partner, but also to try to sell the case for Latin America that some of the types of partnerships which can be exploitative and politically eliminate their options, we don't think that those partnerships may be in Latin America's best interests. And just as Latin America intelligently thought in the 60s and 70s about what type of economic relationships after the tutelage of Raul Prebisch and Manuel Wallerstein was in its interests, I think former Secretary Tillerson was really emphasizing, reminding the Latin Americans that you really need to think a little bit about the types of things that China is really offering you beyond the loan packages, and is that the type of relationship that you believe will help your people? And so it's not everyone stay out, but rather I think we're really trying to encourage Latin Americans to think about the relationship.
Evan, from a strategic perspective, was the 1997 decision to relocate the US Southern Command from Panama to Miami a mistake? How did this affect the reach of the United States into Latin America?
Well, I think in reality, the 1997 decision was part historically driven and part symbolism of larger changes in the region. Of course, historically driven because you remember under the 1977 decision to return the canal to Panama, it was difficult for the United States to basically have its operations located in a place just years away from the 1999 formal return of the Panama Canal Zone to Panamanian sovereignty. And so, many ways, that decision to relocate to Miami was part of the reality of the new U.S. positioning. I don't think that decision in itself significantly undermined the U.S. ability to engage in the region, although it certainly highlighted some of the changes. Of course, at the same time, we have to recall that U.S. Central Command is in Tampa, Florida, and that certainly has not prevented the United States from maintaining a forward presence. It's important to recognize that, yes, over the years there have been a series of important contractions. Of course, the loss of the forward operating location in Manta with Rafael Correa not too many years ago, etc. But I think the larger issue is to what degree does the United States give leadership attention and invest resources wherever the physical location of its headquarters might happen to be. And indeed, in today's world, our internet conversation this evening is testament. One does not need to be physically located in a place in order to have a meaningful dialogue and interaction.
Correct. My colleague David Olney asks, in our region, Japan, India, the United States and Australia are talking about providing some sort of alternative infrastructure fund to counter Chinese spending and influence. Is such an alternative being proposed for your region, and who are the likely players, and what do you think that they can achieve?
It's a great question, and it really goes to part of the contemporary attitude that I think it's critical for the United States to take, not only with respect to Latin America, but other parts of the world. Specifically, we now live in a world in which it's not about the United States trying to go it alone or stop either China or Russia, but rather how the United States, working with other like-minded actors throughout the world, can shape the rules of the game, not to stop China, but to create a transparent, rule-based order in which Chinese economic engagement and other types of engagement can be constructive and help develop, and not the type of, let's call it a Hobbesian world in which all have to live in fears of their future security. And so to that end, although what you referred to, of course, as the Quad, driven by those common interests, has been expressed most acutely in Asia, I think what you see, for example, when you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and frankly, I was very happy that the TPP-11 went forward because I think it's in the U.S. interest to shape the rules of the game. What type of regime is in effect in the Trans-Pacific? Is it a regime where the state that is most able to coordinate a trade in goods-only environment can kick open the doors of intellectual property of others, or do we have a world in which there is protection for intellectual property, protection against non-tariff barriers, opportunities for redress, etc. The same types of questions, I think, for example, as the United States looks at engagement in Latin America. Since the 1970s and 80s, Japan has had a very important presence with its trading companies. Korea, with its chaebol, have had a very important presence. India, in select countries, has a very important presence. All of those actors, including the European actors and including Australian mining companies and others, have vested interests. And the United States can't think in terms of just us versus everyone else, but rather how does the United States and Latin America and elsewhere work with like-minded actors such as Australia, such as Japan, such as Korea, to shape a world in which we can engage with China in a healthy fashion wherever in the globe, and not a world that we have to be fearful of what China is trying to achieve.
Okay, one thing that really comes up from this conversation is the fact that the United States and China may both like accumulating wealth, making money, sharing the wealth, and all that kind of thing. But in the end, they're not complementary systems from a political or a strategic perspective. So while one can look toward trying to shape the way China engages in the world and trying to sort of integrate China into the broader global commons, you are always going to face this kind of dilemma as to how are you going to control or influence the Chinese while the Chinese are also actively trying to influence the way the United States is going about its business, from a political perspective at least.
No, absolutely. I think you raise an excellent point. And in part, it's the sheer size of China and its role in the world economy that in some ways pits Chinese economic activities against those of the United States, not because China is necessarily malevolent. But indeed, if you look at what China has historically tried to achieve in terms of advancing the prosperity and the security of the Chinese people, we, in the 20th century, lived in a largely Eurocentric world in which some of the most important institutional frameworks were built across the Atlantic. We can think of the Bretton Woods system that ordered the global economy and financial system. However, in that system, it was largely a world of European capital and U.S. capital. And the decisions about where factories were built, where value added was realized, and indeed where financial flows went to, was a world that benefited those, and the associated political influence, including, to the lament of Latin America, oftentimes advantaged those who had the capital and structured the system. Now, as China grows, it's almost unthinkable to us in the United States or indeed in Europe, a world in which the returns of capital no longer flow as exclusively to the United States, in which decisions about where value added is realized would be realized in China, where political influence driven by economic power goes to another actor who may not share Western Judeo-Christian values, etc. So in many ways, it's not a question of Chinese malevolence, although certainly their philosophies of governance rooted in Taoisean and Confucian values and concepts like Tianxia look a lot different than those of the West, which tend to be more egalitarian. But I would say that at a more fundamental level, the basic problem of China is that although you can talk about win-win, the global pie does have certain limits, and the expansion of China does mean that there is an infringement on where value added is realized, where the wealth is achieved, and that associated change in influence in Latin America, in Africa, in other places, is creating profound discomfort for many in the United States. And so I think while it's possible to have a world in which both the United States and China benefit, it's a world in which we have to manage that transition very carefully, and so the gains are not realized grossly or asymmetrically by one of those actors and one of those value systems at the expense of the other. And so I think it's not necessarily a fight to the death or a fight for the domination of an ideological system, as we saw with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. But nonetheless, it is a fight of interest with very, very serious consequences for, frankly, Western civilization as we know it.
Actually, speaking of Africa, Evan, our research assistant Shahrazad Khairat asks, China has utilized the same model of investment in trade and geopolitical influence that they perfected in Africa, which is now being emulated in South America to gain influence. Are the Chinese simply mirroring the same methods the Americans have been using for decades to gain influence around the world?
That's a great question. And I think, first of all, it's interesting, having followed to a certain extent Chinese activities in Africa and compared them with Latin America, you do see similarities in the pattern. The Chinese come with a very kind of industrial policy, instrumentalist orientation. In many ways, it's consistent with what you saw 3,000 years ago with the rise of China, but under the different rules of the interconnected global system. In other words, 3,000 years ago, the Chinese sought to deal with the barbarian kingdoms in a way to receive tribute for the enrichment of their kingdom and the recognition of the emperor as the son of heaven. Today, the Chinese seek flows of goods in the world system that benefits China and again Chinese value added. But to do so, whereas our concept of wealth creation is rooted in the texts such as Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, in the idea of the almost the religion of the invisible hand in the market, which makes us inherently skeptical of central planning and industrial policy. China, from a kind of reformed communist orientation, comes from exactly the opposite perspective. They believe in markets, but also have enormous faith in central planning. And so what you see the Chinese have tried to do is to say, okay, well, our economy needs resources. We need oil, we need minerals. So where are the minerals? Africa. Okay, how do we get access to the minerals? Well, the minerals are here. They don't have a road. Well, we can have win-win. So we'll build a road for the Africans, and with that road, we'll be able to get the minerals, and they'll get some of that wealth. You see a very similar strategy in Latin America. Now, as the Chinese have dealt with the world, they increasingly realized that different socioeconomic systems are not always willing to negotiate with the Chinese on those terms. Especially more sophisticated pluralistic systems have been somewhat more resistant. Now in Africa, in places like Mozambique and Angola, etc., China has been able to deal more easily with the elites and have kind of government-to-government deals for that instrumentalist approach. In Latin America, where you have a greater number of relatively well-developed, diversified, politically pluralistic systems, industrialized, such as Mexico, Brazil, etc., that approach has not worked as well. And so what I would argue, first of all, is that there's a remarkable consistency in the basically instrumentalist Chinese approach to both continents and elsewhere. However, Chinese adaptations have been perhaps greater for a number of reasons in Latin America than they have been in Africa. And also their familiarity in Africa, where they have dealt with the region in support of wars of national liberation from the Europeans since the 1970s and 1980s, has been a different situation. Now, how that compares with the U.S. approach, I'd say, again, in many ways, the United States has traditionally tried to advance a framework of rule of law, a framework of open competitive bidding and things like that, rooted in our faith in, again, the structure of laws and the structure of the rules of the game and ideas of equal access to all. However imperfect that has been in practice, whereas I don't think the Chinese have approached it with that illusion. So I think there's a fundamentally different basis for the ways in which the Chinese in the United States and the Europeans approach those engagements. But in the end, it's still, they still have important commonalities as well.
Interesting you should say that. I mean, my own experience in Ethiopia over the last few years has seen, the amount of Chinese investment going into Ethiopia, but also a sort of localized resentment by just the sheer scale of what's going on there. Obviously, the Ethiopians love the development funds coming in because it allows the government of the day to restructure and develop the country, which is a good thing for them. But on the other hand, the idea of Chinese agencies strong-arming local Ethiopian authorities to get Chinese laborers into the country, for instance. It helps displace the idea of local labor. You have to look at the local resentments versus the benefits that flow into the government because the Chinese have got so much going for them in terms of being able to deliver the brown paper bag to the right person at the right time.
Yes.
Evan, over the past 4 decades, Latin America and the Caribbean have become known as a place of political intrigue, a Cold War hotspot, a place of repression, corruption, dictatorship, guerrilla war, drugs, and the source of illegal immigrants. Can one say that the US is tiring of this difficult region?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I would agree with such a universally negative connotation of the region. And it's ironic, I think, in many ways, what you also just expressed is one of the limitations of the Chinese understanding of the region. Because if many in the United States know very little about Latin America, arguably as the Chinese approached the region, they knew less. When you hear stories about Chinese engineers coming and say, well, what does Latin America mean to you? It's beautiful dancing women and samba music and cocaine and violence. And in reality, Latin America is a culturally rich, diverse region. You have a wealth of different climate zones. You have a wealth of both industry, very sophisticated urban areas, as well as others. Just as if one talked about Asia and tried to think of Asia just as one place, it's a great limitation that to try to lump Australia with Indonesia, with Myanmar, with China, with you say, well, wait a minute. But having said that, I think what has happened with the United States is that as part of the U.S. philosophy of global engagement, particularly during and even more after the Cold War, the idea of global engagement implies, almost by necessity, a fixation in places far beyond your own hemisphere. And so to be a player in the Middle East, to be a player in Asia, etc. And so being just a mere regional actor where you are trifling with what is happening in your own hemisphere perhaps seems like house cleaning. And indeed, it's perhaps unfortunate the degree to which, although during the Cold War, certainly the United States paid attention to Soviet activities in the hemisphere. A lot of strategic thinking about what the Soviets were doing through proxies in Nicaragua, in El Salvador, certainly through Cuba. However, after the Cold War, as that immediate threat seemed to erode, Latin America, unfortunately, was taken over by more of a police action thinking. How does the United States manage the effects of crime and violence, things that could, create domestic problems such as immigration, as you point out. And so I think one of the, in many ways, on the one hand, the United States recognition that Latin America was not subject to, for example, the threat of nuclear powers, the threat of extra-hemispheric actors posing immediate military risks, the threat of other types of grave immediate threats to U.S. national security, led to a more of a tendency to ignore the problems of the region or treat them as extensions of domestic problems. I think that has begun to change now with the recognition of the activities of again, China as well as Russia and Iran elsewhere in the hemisphere. But and frankly, one point that is both understood deeply in the United States and yet forgotten at the same time is that there is no region in the world that is more closely tied to U.S. national security and prosperity than is Latin America. If you look at the trade statistics, there is no other region, including Asia, with which we trade more. If you look at where sunk investment is located, there is no region other than Latin America where there is more U.S. investment. So what happens there more immediately affects the U.S. economy. The flows of U.S. agricultural goods, for example, from Mexico, the problems of governance and insecurity, what happens in Mexico, Salvador. If you think about it, ironically, the issues that helped to elect President Donald Trump, the issues of Mexican immigration, the wall, all of those things, indirectly what those issues said is that Latin America is so directly important. And even the issue of immigration, Islamic actors, even that issue indirectly tied to the Mexican border and other things. What those issues said is that what happens in Latin America is so fundamentally important. No other region of the world has fundamentally helped to elect our current president than did Latin America. So I wouldn't say that the United States is tired of Latin American security, but in some ways it can be akin to a good but lazy marriage. When things are, not in danger of an immediate divorce, the risk is that the husband begins to neglect the wife until the person that is wooing his beautiful spouse shows up and forces him to rethink his actions. So I think we're a little bit in that in this moment, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, just following on from that, you raise a number of very interesting points. But if politics is all about perception, then really, how does the perception, whether it's correct or incorrect, play out in terms of American public diplomacy into Latin America? I mean, you mentioned Donald Trump and the perception that Trump has this focus on the wall, the Mexican wall. It's all about security, I grant you that, but it's in a very negative context. Now, if this is part of the US constituency sort of railing against an incorrect philosophy about Mexicans and immigration from South America. How is this actually having a knock-on effect on the Trump administration's public diplomacy in the Latin American capitals? I mean, I think that there must be some sort of impact there.
You raise actually a fantastic point. It's a point that, frankly, I wish more people in the United States understood well, which is the importance of perceptions. And for me, it's fascinating because clearly President Trump is a man who understands perceptions. If one looks at President Trump's brand, his creation of wealth, the Trump Enterprises is about the selling of an image of wealth, an understanding of how you create that idea that associates the Trump name with paying a premium for luxury. In the same way, much of President Trump's success in winning the presidency had to do with his ability to sell the Trump brand and appeal to those voters, oftentimes the forgotten people of the Rust Belt of the United States, the Michigans, the Pennsylvanias, the Ohios, and weave together a message that really leveraged their frustration with the political correctness of the status quo. And so, to me, it's deeply ironic that our president, who understands so well the value of perception in creating his own brand and in propelling himself to office with respect to the U.S. political brand, has not seemed to be as successful in understanding the impact on selling the U.S. brand in Latin America. And as somebody myself that works a great deal in Latin America, I can tell you that the impact of the administration's tweets, whatever good policies that we do, the impact of the perceived insults against the Mexican people by calling them various disparaging their character, etc. The symbolism of the wall. In many ways, if for whatever his good points, left of center populist Andrés Manuel López Obrador is elected president of Mexico, and because of that, Mexico begins to move away from the United States and working more closely with extra-regional actors such as Russia and China, or the degree to which Mexico, using a offended leadership, begins to leverage its traditional leadership to also help push that negative message into the Caribbean and Central America, where it has had influence. In many ways, it's a phenomenon that we, through our perceptions, help to create. In similar ways, much of what inspires the United States in Latin America, if you look at the many places in Latin America where you have places called Barrio Kennedy, you'll see, neighborhoods named after our John F. Kennedy, and the ideas that President Kennedy inspired. The power of the United States is many times is because people have come to believe in what the United States stands for. It stands for democracy and free markets and liberty and things like that. The risk is that if we as a nation undercut the faith that people have in the spirit and the goodness of the American people, and that we, the United States, stand for the shining path, the city on the hill, that we're fighting the good fight. The degree to which we neutralize that, we open a path for others who have other agendas, whether that's Russia or China or others. And so I believe absolutely the importance of really helping to sell the U.S. brand in Latin America and helping to leverage that. And we have many opportunities to leverage that because there are countless people who have studied English, who have spent formative years in the United States, who have attended U.S. universities, who are today the leadership of Latin America. And definitely we need to do a better job of leveraging that and understand that the future of the U.S. and U.S. security is intimately tied to Latin America and other parts of the world, not only having profitable economic relations with us, but also believing in what the United States stands for.
And now for our musical interlude. You're listening to Strategicon, the podcast of SIA.
Fonzie, Chihuahua. Sabes que ya llevo un rato mirándote. Tengo que bailar contigo hoy. Chihuahua. ya estaba llamándome. Muéstrame el camino que yo voy. Oh, tú eres el imán y yo soy el metal. Me voy acercando y voy armando el plan. Solo con pensarlo se acelera el pulso. Oh yeah, ya me está gustando más de lo normal. Todos mis sentidos van pidiendo más. Esto hay que tomarlo sin ningún apuro. Despacito, quiero respirar tu fuego despacito. Deja que te diga cosas al oído, para que te acuerdes si no estás conmigo. Despacito, quiero desnudarte a besos despacito. Firma las paredes de tu laberinto y hacer de tu cuerpo todo un manuscrito.
That was the 2017 hit by Luis Fonsi, Despacito, featuring Daddy Yankee. And now we'll return to our discussion of China in Latin America. David asks, in Australia, we are struggling to make sense of Chinese strategic behaviour and only just realising how deep their regional influence has become. Who understands China well in your area of expertise, and who has made sense of or peace with Chinese influence?
It's a great question. I'll give you a shorter answer this time. I think we've been blessed with a number of very good China scholars here in the United States, but it's difficult to say that anybody truly understands China well. It's interesting, if you looked at the debate in the United States when China joined the World Trade Organization back in 2001, the debate was, what would be the future of China? Would China be transformed by engagement with the West into a liberal democracy? Would China perhaps muddle through with a mixture of different powers? Would the contradictions cause a chaotic collapse in the Chinese Communist Party? But nobody really anticipated, and I say this actually with respect to an excellent presentation that was just given by one of my colleagues, Josh Eisman, and the presentation of a book in which I have a chapter, China Reaches Out. The idea that nobody really predicted a strong China with a consolidated communist party, and a sort of President Xi Jinping, who has transformed the world in the United States through engagement as much as we have affected China in our hubris, believing that we could somehow reform China through the miracle of Western know-how. So I think anybody that claims to understand China has been in some way mistaken. I think that all of our key China scholars have had important insights. I think one can start from somebody such as Mike Pillsbury, who captures the idea of Chinese global aspirations and its impact on U.S. strategic equities, and take a little bit of that, although arguably perhaps Mike Pillsbury goes too far. One can take people like David Shambaugh, who talks about the contradictions of the Chinese Communist Party and the dangers that presents. And although certainly Shambaugh may have overreached in his prediction of the imminent collapse of the party through its own contradictions. There are a number, but I think one has to regard with skepticism anybody outside of China trying to understand what China has to say. And so I think in many ways China itself continues to evolve, and it's questionable whether even within China scholars understand the nature of this ongoing unfolding experiment.
Shahrazad asks, following China's recent inroads into South Asia, in particular Sri Lanka and Pakistan, the CCP are now setting their sights on Latin America. Is this with the aim of spreading influence across the world to further their One Belt, One Road trade program? And what does this mean for the United States?
The relationship between One Belt, One Road in Latin America is fascinating, and I think it goes to the Chinese ability to allow people to believe about China what is beneficial to the Chinese. If you look at all of the maps of One Belt, One Road, you'll never find one with a line that connects China to Latin America that is more than a dashed line. Latin Americans would desperately like to believe that they will be linked to One Belt, One Road, and through that link linkage, enormous, limitless amounts of Chinese investment and associated investment by others, tying into the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, will come to Panama, will come to Brazil, will come to Peru and solve Latin America's development problems in ways that the Europeans and the United States did not. However, the question is whether China wishes to allow Latin America to believe that it will be part and as such tie into the Chinese project, which has almost always been about tying China to other centers of development such as Europe, across Central Asia and elsewhere. China has been masterful, first in dealing with the United States and Europe, allowing our own beliefs and self-projections about democracy and what we could transform China into to allow us to help China to develop itself, to attract Western capitalists to come to China with the dreams of becoming rich, only to find that in the end, while some became rich, more than anything, we helped the Chinese to become rich. Now, Latin America, I think, and really many in Europe, following the lure of One Belt, One Road, are answering that same call. And so I think in many ways, yes, some will become rich. There will be some ties, but more than anything, it's about China, and it's about what benefits China. And again, going back to the 3,000-year-old concept of China's desire to expand its own development through connecting itself to the rest of the world, so that, frankly, just as in 3,000 years ago, the tribute from the barbarian states would flow to the imperial center to the benefit of the Chinese. The Chinese often say win-win. The Chinese are happy that others can win while the Chinese win. But win-win doesn't reflect the Chinese desire to put the Chinese people first and to ensure that whoever is winning, the Chinese ultimately are winning the most.
Evan, does One Belt, One Road actually signify the end of the post-World War II international order, which has been largely American-led?
Well, I think the One Belt, One Road is really a projection of the reassertion of the Chinese concept of concentric circles and global projection, again, going back 3,000 years, onto the template of the world, which is struggling to maintain the institutions established, such as the United Nations in the Bretton Woods system. And so it's an interesting symbol, but I think what you really find is that China in many ways is a expanding monolith, and as that country, as China has expanded, it has caused growing pains and it has caused difficulties for the rest of the system. And so again, the institutions such as ASEAN have been forced to accommodate China. Neighbors, obviously, Australia has had to accommodate China's economic might and influence. Institutions even in Latin America, such as the Corporación Andina de Fomento, or most recently institutions such as CEPAL or the Inter-American Development Bank, have seen that they have had to adapt some of their own rules, some of their own structures for loans to accommodate the Chinese. The International Monetary Fund and the accommodation of the renminbi as part of the world's currency basket. Less clear, more gray accommodations, such as the many think tanks and consulting organizations and universities throughout the world that refrain from saying things overly critical of the Chinese because of their hopes of not jeopardizing projects that they have with the Chinese or hope for access to the Chinese markets. And so I think certainly the One Belt, One Road is a symbol, but what's really happening is a much more subtle and difficult expansion in which little by little the frog is being boiled in the pot. All of the institutions of the Bretton Woods system, they're not collapsing, but rather they are being uncomfortably transformed and distorted as China grows. And it's not clear at what point, the frog tries to jump out of the pot, and at what point one says it's too late. But clearly the temperature is rising.
Well, I mean, if we're waiting for the frog to jump out of the pot, the frog will have to create another environment for the world to actually thrive in. And at the moment, we can see, as you rightly point out, that a lot of the international structures that we've been with since 1945 are in a sort of state of either disrepair, semi-collapse. It's just not working as it should, you know. So obviously, we can hope that perhaps the West will find its mojo, if you like, but I'm not so sure that that's going to happen. When we talk about Chinese loans and investments, there are two theories about China. You make mention that China is an expanding monolith, but of course there are some people who suggest that the time is nigh for the Chinese economy, that, you know, there are some fundamental structural weaknesses in the economy, namely the banking sector and various other aspects that will eventually bring the whole Chinese edifice crashing down onto the international system. If we take that particular position, hypothetically speaking, what do you think are the strings attached to the Chinese loans and investments into Latin America and the Caribbean? And do you think that if the engine of China's growth stops or jutters to a halt, even if only temporarily, how is this going to actually have an effect on illegal immigration going into the United States? I mean, obviously, it's going to have some sort of major impact financially on people in Latin America. How do you think that that's going to play out?
Those are very important questions. First of all, it's interesting. I think as long as I have been predicting the imminent collapse of Venezuela for its contradictions, I've seen my colleagues predicting the imminent collapse of China. I think it's been difficult for us intellectually in the West to imagine the transformation of the locations of value added and returns to capital and decisions and political influence that would cause the transformation of the world of the 20th century to a different world driven by different dynamics. And so we reach for an inherent safety mechanism that will rescue us from ourselves and prevent the collapse of the world that we know and understand. And so I'm not sure how much is wishful thinking as opposed to other things. As I look also at the robustness and the diversity of the Chinese economy, as I look at also the nature of the Confucian authority systems that operates from the family level to the government level, I think there are a lot of things that prevent imminent collapse. Now, having said that, you raised many good points that clearly there are sources of Chinese frustration that have to do with a rebellion against environmental issues, rebellion against corruption, rebellion against poor healthcare, poor education, frustration from high housing prices, etc. There are sources of the financial bubble, the high indebtedness not only of the Chinese state but also Chinese companies with poor feedback, as well as actually record indebtedness of Chinese households. So there are a number of things that allow us to say there could be problems. However, one could easily make similar predictions. I remember in 2008, one could take a look at the financial collapse, and many in China looked at the global financial crisis of 2008 as an example of the flawedness of the Western system, and now that the time had come for China. But if you look at Latin America, if one says, well, what would happen if there was a significant slowing of Chinese growth, or a significant, even a contraction of China? And clearly, we can already see in some of the slowing of growth already the way in which that has impacted commodity prices, and with commodity prices, that has hurt some of the nations most dependent on that. Of course, Chile less hurt because of its sovereign wealth fund and wise decisions, but hurt nonetheless. Countries like Brazil certainly hurt. Countries even Venezuela with the collapse in oil prices, Ecuador to a lesser extent, and certainly you see those. In terms of the collapse of investment, the question is, to what degree would a Chinese collapse probably also result in a global collapse, because it would be associated with an inability to finance U.S. Treasury bonds, which would also probably parallels the U.S. and through the European financial system. And so difficult to imagine a Chinese financial collapse that would not have severe global repercussions. But clearly, in that environment, you would have vast difficulties in Latin America. probably of that, immigration to the United States would be one, but certainly not the only one. But it's also a reminder of what you pointed out as well, is that what China does in Latin America, whether it's creating conditions for greater political instability through expanding corruption, creating environmental damage, contributing to politically unstable states that are pushed back past their logical sustainment point, like Venezuela. Anything that happens with China, to the extent to which China undermines governance in Latin America through its actions, the repercussions are externalized to the United States, because we are connected to Latin America through ties of geography much more. Latin American immigrants, if China mucks things up through its actions, are not going to go to China. They're going to come to Texas. They're going to come to Louisiana. They're going to come to Washington, D.C. Much as, ironically, what happens in, when China mucks around with Indonesia, Australia feels the brunt of those actions. It's so certainly that interdependency and where the results are externalized is very important to understand for the United States as well as for China.
Are these kind of strategic pressure points that Beijing is actually aware of? I mean, do you think that there's a case of deliberation where they know that if they need to ramp up a crisis to deflect from their own domestic problems, that they can, create an incident in Latin America which will have a knock-on effect on the United States, or for that matter, create something in Indonesia that will have a knock-on effect on Australia? I mean, do you think that the Politburo thinks in those terms, or do you think that if anything were to happen, in Latin America that affects the United States, it's more a case of an accident rather than a design by the Chinese?
That's a great question. Let me try to give it the consideration it's due at multiple different levels. I think right now China is primarily pursuing its own economic interests, as well as doing some strategic shaping, largely with only minimum attention to the externalities, which China does not feel that much. And so, for example, what you see if you take a look at the structure of value added in Brazil is what many people have referred to as the deindustrialization of Brazil. China is buying more and more commodities from Brazil, primarily oil and iron and soy, and the relative percentage of manufactured goods in Brazil's export basket is declining, making the Brazilian economy much more fragile, for example. However, that has not impacted China. On the other hand, you find things such as, for example, when Chinese companies build substandard mining projects, such as when they build poor retaining walls. For example, the Chinese company Yungi in Bolivia, the mining wall broke and poisoned the local community. Something similar happened actually with a mine that used to belong to an Australian company that was then bought by China Minmetals, Las Bombas. And again, when there were some environmental problems, the results were externalized onto a Peruvian community, or, for example, in Marcona in Peru. So as China has begun to realize that the bad things that its companies do are costing its business, the Chinese government is instrumentally trying to become a better shepherd of those businesses. Not necessarily because it so sincerely cares about Latin America because it feels its interconnectedness with Latin America, but rather because it's costing its business. But you also raise another very interesting point, which is what China does both in Asia and elsewhere. And I think there's an important security component, and that is, for example, I don't believe that China actively seeks a global conflict, for example, with the United States. However, many in China are very familiar with Organski and more recently others talk about power transition theory and this idea that a rising power like China will not be accepted by an establishing power by the United States who could try to stop its rise one way or another. And so I think people like the People's Liberation Army are convinced that not because it wants to, but China may have to confront some type of conflict with the United States having to do with that power transition. As China prepares for that conflict, as all responsible militaries do, it's unfathomable for me as a military security analyst to think that China would allow the United States to just play an away game as the United States did in, for example, the first war in Iraq. Rather, China will fully exploit its global assets, its commercial influence throughout the world, not only to try to inhibit coalition formation in places like Latin America, but also to use that commercial presence in order to either create, crises, or to bring political pressures, or to gather intelligence, or to introduce forces who could, for example, impact U.S. Deployment or sustainment flows, et cetera, or indeed, in the case of an extreme extended conflict, even project forces leveraging its knowledge of the logistics of Latin American airports and seaports and other places and its working relationships with Latin American militaries to introduce forces to be used from certain places, just as it does elsewhere. And so I think it's important to understand that while China is not malevolently seeking, planning how to exploit crises throughout the world, in the world of military security planners who have to think about these things, the Chinese commercial position does create options that one does have to consider. And certainly Australia is, closest to China. And so as Australia looks at the new militarized islands, the new reality that China has created in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and the new range for which it can project its H-6 bombers and its new J-20 fighters and other things, and the way in which Chinese economic pressures and political pressures are making, Australians ever more uncomfortable, the way in which even China is seeking to shape Australian politics and Australian politicians through political donations, one realizes that it's a world in which one is not looking to be malevolent, but those future scenarios raise considerations and create concerns.
Well, if a nation-state is a self-interested party, China in that sense is really no different from any other country. I mean, they're only pursuing their own interests. But it's interesting that you should mention about, the maneuverings that may be going on within the Latin American space. From a geopolitical perspective, Evan, there's been a lot of talk about Brazil being the economic powerhouse and strategic leader of Latin America. This assumes that the country has some significant sovereign economic and strategic capabilities. However, if it, like the remainder of Latin America, become net importers of Chinese goods, services, labour and machinery, as you've just said, how is it likely to impact on the sovereign capability of Latin American states and the regional balance of power? Is China involved in picking a strategic winner to act as its regional proxy?
That's a great question. I think actually China is perhaps moving away from some of the more limited approaches that it has had. Traditionally, China has actually looked to regions in terms of one or two national, major players who were dignified of dealing with China. So, for example, in Latin America, one of the first places where China concentrated its efforts was Brazil. And indeed, if you look at the Chinese Foreign Ministry's choice of where to create strategic partnerships, its first three strategic partnerships were Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina, all the largest states which were presumed to have influence over their neighbors. China's idea being we will develop ties with these little brothers, and those little brothers will help to bring the rest of states in line, much in keeping with this hierarchical Confucian concept. Now, with time, China has diversified that. China has come to understand the differences in Latin America, that you can't just deal with South America through Brazil, and that has a lot of strategic consequences. But certainly China is making those bets. And I think part of that also is what you also see at the same time is China has a key player approach. It is simultaneously overlapped with multiple other approaches that all exist in a kind of interdependency. So in addition to the big brother approach that we just mentioned, you also have a regional approach. And so, for example, in Africa, China has chosen to bring together the organization FOCAC for the past, since the early 2000s. And FOCAC, implicitly the idea is stunning, which is that only together is Africa, worth, basically dealing with China. So collectively, all of Africa to China. And indeed, it's not a place, FOCAC, where Africa advances a common agenda for how it deals with China, but rather Africa basically assembles around the Chinese Christmas tree to receive individual gifts in an atomized fashion. The same thing with CELAC in Latin America, which China has basically driven its agenda. If you look at the China CELAC 5-year plan 2015-2019 and now the 2019-2021 3-year plan, those are plans that are largely allowing China to drive an agenda in which it shapes how it will relate and develop its relationship with a collective Latin America. Now, ironically, at the same time with those two approaches exist two others. One is a kind of a developmentalist approach, whereas if you go to take a look at China's rhetoric, President Xi's rhetoric when he came to Trinidad and Tobago, you get the sense that China will superficially treat the small nations of the Caribbean as just as dignified as dealing with the United States. In its diplomatic protocol, China does that arguably far better than we do in the United States. And yet that lives in contradiction with the other two models I just mentioned. And then, of course, the idea of what is sometimes called the G2, this idea that China and the United States, through the strategic and economic dialogue with the United States, managing its relationship of how both great powers deal with the United States to avoid conflict. And so, in many ways, at the end of the day, it's all about China advancing its objectives. And if it uses four completely contradictory and overlapping concepts to advance those objectives, even as it also pursues individual bilateral diplomacy, party-to-party diplomacy, corporate diplomacy, etc., we in the United States feel the compulsion to try to make everything consistent. The Chinese, inconsistent with Sun Tzu, for example, are perfectly consistent to do 15 different contradictory things all at the same time if, at the end of the day, they advance Chinese strategic objectives.
Okay, well, finally, Evan, while the Trump administration appears to many outside observers disinterested in strategic matters, it is potentially stumbling into a trade war with China at some stage of his presidency. If this happens, how do you see Latin America and the Caribbean playing out as a potential economic battlefield between Chinese and American interests?
I would respectfully say that Latin America probably would not be a battlefield between China and the United States. I mean, the presumption is that it's a similar world to the Cold War, in which there were two primary alternatives ideologically, the Soviet Union and the United States. But in reality, what's going on in Latin America is a globalized, multifaceted engagement. I think maybe the example is more the European example of Machiavelli's Italy or the Germanic states. We're not used to, in the United States, thinking of Latin America in multipolar, multidimensional terms. But if you look at the options that Latin America has, there's a very complex space in which you have to understand, for example, if some sort of competition or what is happening right now, for example, as the United States has pulled away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the United States is renegotiating NAFTA. Well, Mexico is in a position in which, it structurally competes with China. So the Mexicans aren't saying, well, we're going to move away from the U.S. market, which is, 3 days shipping away, or sometimes 1 day driving across the border away. We're just going to move all the maquiladora plants. No, what Mexico is doing is saying, okay, how do we diversify? How does Mexico relate more economically to Latin America? How does it rethink its relationship with India? How does it really think its relationship with Japan, etc.? The same thing with the pull out of the TPP. The Chileans are moving to rethink their bilateral relationships, and how do they strengthen the relationships with the Europeans, with the Japanese, with the Koreans. The same thing with the Peruvian government. And at a corporate level, again, there is deep discomfort with Chinese both developmental banks as well as commercial banks like CCB. And so I think what the Europeans are trying to do, what the Latin Americans are trying to do, as the United States has really kind of sown a bit of confusion and concern through that rhetoric, is they're not rushing into the hands of China, nor are they rushing into the hands, frankly, of Russia, who lacks the capital and markets, but they have been pursuing a diversification approach that's been reaching out more to Europe, reaching out more to others. And I think we'll continue to see more of that. And in any corporate deal, again, if you look at the mining sector, it's not the United States versus China. It's, there are, Australian mining players. I mean, Rio Tinto, BHP Billiton, or if you look in the port sector, it's about the Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans. And so basically the U.S. withdrawal from the space, if nothing else, is really opening up the degree to which there's really a multifaceted space of companies and countries, etc. Yes, U.S. leadership is needed. U.S. help, U.S. strategic vision is needed. But it's not a new bipolar war, but it's really opening up a multidimensional, complex space for Latin America.
Evan, many thanks for being with us today and for sharing your very deep insights on Chinese investment in Latin America. We hope that we may be able to call you again in the future for other things with regard to Latin America. I think that Venezuela is a country that has really piqued our interest down here, so maybe we can have you again on Strategicon soon.
It would be my pleasure. A real pleasure being with you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, TuneIn and YouTube, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, Twitter or SoundCloud, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. Until next time, goodbye.
Connect with your potential customers wherever they are. Effective uses Comcast viewership data insights to combine advanced targeting capabilities with premium TV and streaming content, so you can deliver the best ad experiences to your audience no matter how they watch. Visit EFFECTV.com.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.